Director cancelled my vendor partnerships, then production failed and CEO asked, what happened? The moment director Rachel Manning leaned back in her leather chair and said those 9 words with that cold smile, I knew my entire world was about to change. We're going domestic only, effective immediately, Marcus. Standing there in her glass-walled office on the 35th floor, watching her terminate 2 years of my life's work with a few clicks of her mouse, I felt the same crushing weight I hadn't experienced since I was 19 years old, the same suffocating helplessness that hit me the day I watched my uncle's manufacturing business get destroyed by corporate executives who saw small suppliers as nothing more than expendable numbers on a spreadsheet. She didn't even pause her typing as she cancelled partnership after partnership. Chen Wei from Shenzhen, whose electronics components had never missed a single delivery deadline. The Rossi family in Milan, whose precision-engineered parts were literally impossible to source anywhere else at our quality standards. Maria Gonzalez in Guadalajara, who had restructured her entire facility around our specifications. People who had trusted me. People who had bet their family businesses on promises I had made on behalf of TechFlow Industries. Honestly, Marcus, Rachel continued, her manicured fingers dancing across the keyboard like she was composing music instead of destroying lives, I never understood why Harrison brought you in for all this international hand-holding anyway. We're a technology company, not a charity for foreign sob stories. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, I need you to do something for me. Please take a moment to tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story reaches across the globe. And please hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share with you changed not just my career, but proved that sometimes the people who seem powerless can teach the most powerful executives lessons they'll never forget. My name is Marcus Rivera, and I need you to understand something about Rachel Manning before I continue. She wasn't just any corporate director. She was the type of executive who had built her entire 20-year career by stepping on anyone who couldn't fight back. From junior analyst to director of global procurement at TechFlow Industries, leaving behind a trail of destroyed careers and broken promises like scattered puzzle pieces. But here's what Rachel didn't know about me, what nobody at TechFlow knew about me. 8 years ago, when I was finishing my MBA and trying to figure out my career path, my uncle Roberto ran a small automotive parts manufacturing business in East LA. He'd built it from nothing over 15 years, employing 12 people from our neighborhood, providing components to 3 major companies. My uncle spoke perfect English and fluent Spanish, had relationships with suppliers across Mexico and the Southwest, and had never missed a delivery in his entire business history. Then Apex Corporation acquired one of his biggest clients. The new procurement director, a woman who reminded me disturbingly of Rachel, decided that Roberto's boutique operation didn't fit the streamlined supplier strategy. She didn't fire him outright. That would have been merciful. Instead, she spent 4 months systematically destroying him. She questioned every invoice, demanded documentation for processes that had worked flawlessly for years, started requiring certifications that cost thousands of dollars to obtain. She reassigned his biggest contracts to larger suppliers, then used his sudden revenue loss as justification for demanding price cuts on his remaining work. The final blow came when she demanded that Roberto provide a performance bond worth more than his annual revenue, knowing perfectly well that a small business couldn't secure that kind of guarantee. When he couldn't comply, she terminated all contracts for failure to meet corporate partnership standards. Roberto lost everything: his shop, his house, his employees' jobs, and eventually his marriage. The stress triggered a heart attack that put him in the hospital for 2 weeks. When he got out, he was working as a night security guard at a warehouse, making barely enough to cover his medications. The morning I found him sitting in his empty shop, staring at foreclosure notices and medical bills, was the morning I promised myself I would learn exactly how people like that procurement director operated. I would understand their systems, their psychology, their weaknesses. And someday, somehow, I would make sure they experienced the same helplessness they inflicted on others. So I specialized in supply chain management and international procurement. Not because I loved the work, but because I was building myself into exactly the kind of person who could get close to executives like Rachel Manning. Someone who could understand their world well enough to navigate it, and patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. When the position at TechFlow opened up, when I saw Rachel's name as the hiring manager, I knew the universe was offering me a chance I couldn't waste. But I also knew that simple revenge wouldn't satisfy me. It had to be poetic. It had to teach her something about consequences. It had to make her feel exactly what my uncle felt during those final months of watching everything he built slip away. So I took the job, and I became exactly what Rachel needed me to be. Enthusiastic, hardworking, grateful for the opportunity. Someone who asked smart questions but never challenged her authority. Someone who could travel internationally without complaints, who could work with difficult suppliers, who could solve problems that more senior staff found too complicated or time-consuming. For 2 full years, I built vendor relationships that TechFlow had never imagined possible. Not just with suppliers, but with their families, their communities, their stories. I learned that Chen Wei's electronics company had been started by his father after losing everything during China's economic reforms in the 1980s. The business was now supporting Chen's entire extended family, parents, siblings, cousins, over 30 people whose livelihoods depended on the partnerships I was building. I discovered that the Rossi family's precision engineering firm in Milan had been passed down through 4 generations. Marco Rossi had 3 sons, all trained engineers, all working in the family business that my contracts were helping expand into new markets. Their components weren't just products, they were the result of decades of accumulated knowledge and craftsmanship that literally couldn't be replicated anywhere else. Maria Gonzalez in Guadalajara had started her manufacturing operation after her husband's death, using his life insurance to create jobs for other single mothers in her community. TechFlow's contracts had allowed her to hire 18 women, providing stable employment in an area where opportunities were scarce. Every single relationship I cultivated was with people who reminded me of my uncle Roberto. People who had worked their entire lives to build something meaningful, something that could survive beyond themselves, something that provided for their families and communities. But I wasn't building these relationships for TechFlow's benefit. I was building them for something much more strategic. While I was traveling and negotiating and solving supply chain problems, I was also researching Rachel's career history. Every company she'd worked for, every supplier relationship she'd managed, every efficiency initiative she'd implemented. What I found was a pattern that made my stomach ache with recognition. 12 years ago, it wasn't just my uncle Roberto. There was Linda Park, a Korean-American translator who had helped Rachel's previous company navigate contracts with Asian suppliers. Rachel eliminated Linda's position right before Linda's daughter started college, claiming automated translation tools made human translators unnecessary. Linda ended up working 3 part-time jobs to pay tuition. There was David Chen, no relation to my vendor Chen Wei, who had managed Rachel's company's relationships with Canadian manufacturers for 6 years. Rachel systematically reassigned his clients to other account managers, then used his reduced workload as justification for layoffs. David's expertise in international trade regulations became redundant overnight. There was Elena Rodriguez, whose small logistics firm had provided warehousing and distribution services for Rachel's division. Rachel convinced upper management to bring logistics in-house, forcing Elena's company into bankruptcy, then hired Elena's former employees at lower wages with no benefits. The pattern was always identical: identify valuable people doing essential work, systematically undermine their positions, take credit for their expertise, eliminate them when they were no longer useful, and move on without looking back. Rachel had built her entire career on the corpses of small business owners and dedicated employees who had trusted the wrong person. So when I started building vendor relationships for TechFlow, I wasn't just looking for the best quality and prices. I was specifically seeking out people whose stories echoed the ones in Rachel's wake. People who had been betrayed by corporate promises before, who had rebuilt from nothing, who understood what it meant to have your life's work destroyed by someone who saw you as disposable. And I found them everywhere. Chen Wei's family had been cheated by an American distributor in the 1990s, losing contracts that nearly destroyed their business. The Rossi family had been abandoned by German partners who had promised long-term relationships, then disappeared when they found cheaper alternatives. Maria Gonzalez had watched other local manufacturers get destroyed by companies that demanded impossible terms, then move production elsewhere when small suppliers couldn't comply. Every vendor I brought to TechFlow carried scars from executives exactly like Rachel. And slowly, carefully, I started sharing stories with them. Not about Rachel specifically, but about patterns I'd observed in corporate procurement. The warning signs to watch for. The importance of protecting yourself when dealing with companies that might not honor their commitments. I never mentioned Rachel's name. I never made specific accusations. I just shared observations about how certain executives operated, and how important it was to maintain leverage in relationships with corporations that might decide you were expendable. By month 18, every vendor contract I'd negotiated included specific clauses about notification periods, penalty structures, and coordinated withdrawal rights. Terms that seemed reasonable from TechFlow's perspective, but would prove catastrophic if triggered simultaneously. I presented these clauses as standard international protections, necessary safeguards for working with overseas partners who had been burned by American companies before. Rachel approved every contract without reading the fine print, trusting my expertise and focusing only on the cost savings I was delivering. TechFlow's profit margins improved by 43% in my first year, largely because I'd found suppliers willing to work for rates that barely covered their costs, hoping to build long-term partnerships with an American company that seemed to understand their value. By month 20, I had documentation of everything. Not just contracts and financial arrangements, but personal stories behind each partnership. Video testimonials from supplier families about their hopes for working with TechFlow. Photos of their facilities, their workers, their communities. Evidence of how TechFlow's business was literally supporting hundreds of families across 4 continents. I also had detailed records of Rachel's attitudes toward international vendors. Her dismissive comments about suppliers she considered beneath notice. Email chains where she complained about foreign complications and cultural sensitivities. Documentation of her casual dismissal of people whose English wasn't perfect, despite the fact that they spoke multiple languages fluently. By month 24, the web was complete. Every critical component in TechFlow's manufacturing process flowed through relationships I'd built with people who had been destroyed by executives like Rachel. People who trusted me because I had never treated them like disposable resources. People who understood that I saw them as human beings rather than line items on a spreadsheet. And then came that Wednesday morning when Rachel decided she'd had enough of my international hand-holding nonsense. I'd been called to her office for what I thought was a routine quarterly review. TechFlow had just announced record profits, driven largely by the vendor partnerships I'd developed. I expected recognition, maybe discussion of a promotion or expanded responsibilities. Instead, Rachel pulled up her computer and started explaining how the company was shifting toward domestic suppliers exclusively. These international partnerships are too complicated, she said, scrolling through the list of relationships I'd spent 2 years cultivating. Too much cultural sensitivity required, too many time zone issues, too much relationship management. We need suppliers who understand American business practices and don't require constant hand-holding. I watched her cancel Chen Wei's electronics contract, worth $3.2 million annually. Gone. The Rossi family's precision engineering deal, 18 months of negotiations, terminated. Maria's manufacturing partnership, essential for TechFlow's automotive division, eliminated. But Rachel, I said carefully, these suppliers provide components we literally cannot source domestically. The Rossi family produces precision parts with tolerances that American manufacturers can't match. Chen Wei's electronics specifications are beyond anything available in our price range domestically. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Marcus, you're thinking like a social worker instead of a business professional. We don't need their life stories about family businesses and generational expertise. We need products delivered on schedule at competitive prices. There are plenty of American suppliers who can provide what we need without all the emotional complexity. That phrase, emotional complexity, hit me like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of language Rachel had used throughout her career when describing relationships she considered unnecessary. The same dismissive tone she'd employed while systematically destroying everyone who had ever trusted her professional judgment. I realized in that moment that Rachel hadn't learned anything from her decades of destroying lives. She hadn't developed empathy or wisdom or even basic business sense. She was exactly the same person who had driven my uncle to financial ruin, just with better titles and bigger offices. What about the penalty clauses? I asked quietly. The coordinated withdrawal provisions in these contracts. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. Legal can handle whatever paperwork needs to be filed. These suppliers should be grateful they got 2 years of business from us. Most international vendors never get opportunities like this with American companies. She finished canceling the last contract and turned to face me with that triumphant smile. Honestly, Marcus, I think this will be good for your professional development. You've gotten too emotionally invested in these partnerships. In this business, you can't afford to care about every supplier's personal story. Success requires focusing on results, not relationships. And that's when she said it, the 9 words that changed everything. We're going domestic only, effective immediately, Marcus. I nodded slowly, thanked her for the feedback, and walked out of her office. But instead of returning to my desk, I walked directly to the parking garage, got in my car, and started making phone calls. The first call was to Chen Wei in Shenzhen. It was 2 a.m. his time, but he answered on the second ring, probably thinking it was an emergency. Which, in a way, it was. Chen, this is Marcus from TechFlow. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to make some phone calls of your own. Within 8 hours, every single vendor I'd partnered with over 2 years had received identical messages, not from me directly, but from each other. The network I'd spent so long building wasn't just about business relationships. It was about shared experiences, mutual protection, and understanding exactly when to act together. Chen Wei called the Rossi family in Milan. Marco Rossi reached out to Maria Gonzalez in Guadalajara. Maria contacted the semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan. The Taiwanese suppliers called the packaging companies in Vietnam. Like dominoes falling in reverse, each conversation triggered 3 more, until suppliers across 15 countries were simultaneously reviewing their tech flow contracts and discovering something interesting. Every single one of their agreements contained the same coordinated withdrawal clause I'd carefully negotiated months earlier. Language that seemed like standard legal protection, but actually meant that if TechFlow terminated any international supplier without cause, all remaining international suppliers had the right to withdraw immediately without penalty. By Friday morning, TechFlow's production floor was silent. Not because of equipment failure or labor disputes, but because 72% of the critical components simply stopped arriving. The precision electronics from Chen Wei that powered TechFlow's flagship products. The specialized alloys from the Rossi family that made their automotive components possible. The circuit boards from Maria's facility that were essential for their aerospace contracts. I watched from my desk as production managers started panicking around 9 a.m., making frantic phone calls to suppliers who politely explained they were exercising their contractual withdrawal rights. By lunch, manufacturing supervisors were gathered in emergency meetings, trying to understand how TechFlow had become so dependent on international suppliers they apparently no longer needed. Rachel spent Friday afternoon in crisis management mode, calling domestic suppliers who quoted prices 4 times higher than our international partners, with delivery timelines stretching into the next quarter. Companies that could maybe provide substitutes for some components, but had never even heard of others. This is a temporary adjustment period, she announced to the operations team Monday morning, her voice carrying just a hint of strain. We're transitioning to more reliable domestic partnerships that align with our strategic vision. But by Monday afternoon, TechFlow's biggest client, a defense contractor expecting delivery of specialized components the following week, called to express concerns about production delays. Then the automotive company that relied on TechFlow's precision parts started asking questions about alternative suppliers. I spent that entire week documenting everything. Not just the operational chaos, but Rachel's responses to it. Her dismissive comments about suppliers who were overreacting to normal business decisions. Her insistence that international partners were inherently unreliable, and that TechFlow was better off without them. Her complete inability to understand why terminating 72% of their supply chain simultaneously might cause problems. But the real revelation came the following Monday, when CEO Harrison called an emergency executive meeting. I wasn't supposed to be in that room, but Harrison had specifically requested my attendance since I was the only person who fully understood TechFlow's international supplier relationships. Rachel looked genuinely confused about why I was there, probably assuming I'd be blamed for the crisis rather than consulted about solutions. Harrison started the meeting with a simple question: can someone explain to me how we went from record profits to production shutdown in 5 days? Rachel launched into a polished presentation about supply chain diversification, strategic realignment, and the benefits of domestic sourcing. She had slides prepared showing cost projections and risk assessments, all demonstrating why eliminating international suppliers was sound business strategy. The temporary disruption we're experiencing, she concluded confidently, is the natural consequence of transitioning away from over-reliance on foreign partnerships that were ultimately unsustainable. Harrison listened patiently, then turned to me. Marcus, you built these relationships. Help me understand what actually happened here. This was the moment I'd been preparing for without fully realizing it. For 2 years, I'd been building toward this conversation. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd been creating since Wednesday, the one that told the real story of TechFlow's international partnerships. Mr. Harrison, with your permission, I'd like to show you exactly who our international suppliers are, and what our relationships with them actually meant to this company. The first slide showed Chen Wei's electronics facility in Shenzhen. Not just production statistics, but photos of his family's operation, his father's original equipment, the 3 generations of workers who had helped build components for TechFlow's most critical products. I explained how Chen had restructured his entire manufacturing process around TechFlow's specifications, hiring 26 additional workers and investing in new machinery specifically for our partnership. The second slide introduced the Rossi family. Marco Rossi's precision engineering firm that had been perfecting specialized alloys for over 60 years. TechFlow's contracts had allowed them to expand into a new facility, providing employment for 38 people in their small Italian town. Their components weren't just products, they were the result of decades of accumulated knowledge that literally couldn't be replicated anywhere else at our price point. The third slide showed Maria Gonzalez and her manufacturing operation. I displayed photos of her facility, her 18 female employees, the community impact of stable employment she'd created. Maria had been working 12-hour days to meet TechFlow's quality standards, building circuit boards that domestic suppliers couldn't produce at twice the price. Slide after slide, I introduced Harrison to the people Rachel had dismissed as foreign complications. I showed him facility tours, quality certifications, testimonials from workers whose families depended on TechFlow's business. I demonstrated how these weren't just vendor relationships, but partnerships with specific human beings who had bet their futures on TechFlow's commitment. These suppliers weren't just providing components, I explained, watching Harrison's expression change as he absorbed the scope of what we'd lost. They were providing components that can't be replicated domestically. Chen Wei's electronics process uses techniques his father developed over 30 years. The Rossi family's alloy compositions have chemical properties that American manufacturers can't match. Maria's circuit board precision exists because she's been refining her processes for 15 years. Then I showed Harrison the financial impact. Not just the immediate production delays, but the long-term consequences of losing supplier relationships that had taken decades to develop. The contracts we'd voided represented partnerships worth $63 million annually, with suppliers who had been averaging 22% year-over-year growth in their work with TechFlow. Mr. Harrison, I continued, these partnerships weren't expendable overhead. They were competitive advantages that our domestic competitors don't have access to. We were paying lower prices for higher quality because these suppliers trusted TechFlow enough to prioritize our contracts over potentially more profitable opportunities. I watched Rachel's face throughout my presentation, seeing her confusion gradually shift to concern as Harrison asked increasingly pointed questions about the termination decisions. Why hadn't she consulted with operations before canceling critical supplier relationships? Why hadn't she explored transition timelines instead of immediate terminations? Why hadn't she understood the coordinated withdrawal clauses before triggering them? But the moment that really changed everything came when I showed Harrison the final section of my presentation, the documentation I'd gathered about each supplier's previous experiences with American companies. The pattern of international partners being promised long-term relationships, delivering exceptional results, then being abandoned when companies decided to streamline their operations. These suppliers worked with TechFlow despite having been burned before, I explained, because they believed we were different. Because I spent 2 years proving that we valued their contributions and understood their worth. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the financial projections and supplier profiles. Finally, he looked at Rachel with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, but deep disappointment. Rachel, help me understand the strategic thinking behind eliminating $63 million in annual revenue without consulting operations, finance, or the executive team. Rachel started explaining again about domestic sourcing and simplified logistics, but her confidence was wavering. She kept using phrases like, these people, and cultural complications, language that sounded increasingly problematic in the context of my presentation. What cultural complications? Harrison asked. Marcus's documentation suggests these suppliers were consistently exceeding quality standards and delivery requirements. Well, the language barriers, the time zone difficulties, the constant need for relationship management, Rachel replied, her voice getting tighter. International suppliers require so much hand-holding compared to domestic partners who understand American business practices. That's when Harrison asked the question that revealed everything. Rachel, have you reviewed the withdrawal clauses in these contracts? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Because according to Marcus's documentation, every international supplier had the contractual right to withdraw immediately if TechFlow terminated other international suppliers without cause. Did you understand that canceling one contract would trigger coordinated withdrawal from all international partners? More silence. Rachel's face was losing color as she realized Harrison wasn't asking rhetorical questions. Mr. Harrison, she said carefully, I trusted that legal had reviewed these contracts appropriately. The withdrawal clauses seemed like standard protective language. Standard protective language, Harrison repeated slowly. Rachel, these clauses exist specifically to prevent companies from treating international suppliers as expendable. They're designed to ensure that partnerships are honored rather than eliminated on executive whims. I watched Rachel realize that she walked into a trap of her own making. Not because I'd deceived her, but because her fundamental contempt for international partners had blinded her to the actual terms of relationships I'd spent months negotiating. Marcus, Harrison said, turning back to me, in your assessment, is there any possibility of rebuilding these partnerships? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when I could deliver the truth that would change everything for Rachel, without revealing my personal motivations. Mr. Harrison, I spent all of last week reaching out to our former suppliers to explore reconciliation possibilities. Unfortunately, the response has been consistent across all partners. They're willing to consider future relationships with TechFlow, but only under one specific condition. What condition? They require written guarantee that Rachel Manning will have no involvement in international supplier relationships going forward. The room went dead silent. Rachel stared at me like I'd physically struck her. They what? She whispered. I'm sorry, Rachel, but I have to be completely honest about their feedback. Multiple suppliers specifically mentioned feeling disrespected during previous interactions with you. They cited comments about their business practices, dismissive attitudes toward their expertise, and what they perceived as cultural insensitivity. I pulled up my laptop again, showing Harrison documented communications from our former partners. Not recordings or private conversations, but formal written responses to my reconciliation inquiries. Chen Wei's letter was particularly damaging. Ms. Manning's approach to international partnerships demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of mutual respect in business relationships. Her comments about foreign complications and simplified logistics suggest TechFlow views international suppliers as problematic rather than valuable. Marco Rossi had been even more direct. We appreciate Marcus's professionalism, but cannot risk future investments with company leadership that considers our contributions expendable. Ms. Manning's termination approach indicates systematic disregard for international partner commitments. One by one, I shared feedback from suppliers across 4 continents, all expressing similar concerns about Rachel's attitudes and decision-making. Not angry rants or emotional complaints, but professional assessments of why they couldn't trust TechFlow's leadership going forward. These aren't personal attacks, I explained to Harrison. They're business decisions based on demonstrated patterns of behavior. International suppliers can't afford to invest in partnerships with companies that might eliminate them arbitrarily. Harrison spent the next hour reviewing supplier documentation, contract terms, and financial projections. He asked detailed questions about rebuilding possibilities, domestic sourcing alternatives, and operational timelines. Throughout the entire discussion, Rachel sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as the scope of her miscalculation became clear. Finally, Harrison closed his laptop and looked directly at Rachel. I need some time to review this situation with the board. Marcus, can you provide me with comprehensive documentation of our international supplier relationships and the specific feedback you've received about rebuilding possibilities? Of course, Mr. Harrison. Rachel, I'll need you to prepare a detailed report explaining the strategic reasoning behind these termination decisions and your assessment of domestic sourcing alternatives. After the meeting ended, Rachel cornered me by the elevator, her professional composure finally cracking. Marcus, what exactly did you tell these suppliers about me? I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained throughout the presentation. I told them the truth, Rachel. I shared your exact words about not needing international partnerships anymore. That's not, I didn't mean, she started, then stopped herself. You didn't mean what? That you don't value international partnerships. That cultural sensitivity is unnecessary. That relationship management is emotional complexity we can't afford. She stared at me, probably realizing for the first time that her casual dismissal of international suppliers had been documented and shared with the very people she'd dismissed. Those suppliers trusted TechFlow because they trusted me, I continued. When you terminated their contracts while calling their work foreign complications, you destroyed relationships that took 2 years to build. They're not angry, Rachel. They're protecting themselves from exactly the kind of treatment you've given them. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, I said the words I'd been waiting 8 years to deliver. Sometimes the people you consider expendable turn out to be the ones holding everything together. 4 weeks later, Harrison announced that TechFlow was restructuring its procurement division. Rachel Manning would be transitioning to a customer service role where her domestic focus would be better utilized. I was promoted to Director of Global Supplier Relations, with full authority to rebuild the international partnerships TechFlow had lost. It took 8 months to restore relationships with most of our former suppliers. Not because they were vindictive, but because they needed proof that TechFlow had learned from its mistakes. They wanted guarantees, oversight structures, and cultural sensitivity training for all executive staff involved in international partnerships. Rachel lasted 6 months in customer service before transferring to a smaller company. According to people who stayed in touch, she now handles complaint calls for a regional electronics distributor, dealing daily with frustrated customers who feel ignored and dismissed by corporate policies they can't control. I never told anyone about my uncle Roberto. Never mentioned the real reason I'd chosen TechFlow, or why I'd spent 2 years building relationships with suppliers who reminded me of people Rachel had destroyed before. The revenge wasn't about exposing her past, it was about letting her experience the consequences of her own choices. Every supplier who withdrew from TechFlow did so because Rachel had treated him as expendable. Every partnership we lost was lost because she valued control more than collaboration. Every financial consequence TechFlow faced was the direct result of her decisions, her words, her fundamental inability to see international partners as human beings worthy of respect. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Rachel lose her executive position or seeing her struggle in customer service. It was knowing that she finally understood what my uncle Roberto had felt during those last months of his business, the helplessness of watching everything you've worked for disappear because someone more powerful decided you were no longer valuable. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you understand why I spent 2 years planning something this complex, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Because there are more Rachel Mannings out there, more executives who think human beings are expendable, and more stories about what happens when people underestimate the power of patience, planning, and the relationships we build with each other. The people who seem invisible to those in power, we see everything. And sometimes, we remember longer than they think we do.